Hello, welcome to another special edition of Inside the Birds. Geoff Mosher here, and we bring back our analytics and contract expert, Sam Finkel. And we are getting closer to NFL free agency. It begins Monday at noon with the legal tampering period, which we all know is more than legal tampering. A lot of contracts will be out there and into the public arena as soon as that deadline starts. And then the true new league year, Sam, begins 4 o'clock Wednesday. By that point, everybody knows where all the big name guys are going. What we're going to do in this, it's kind of a two-part episode here. We're going to talk about a couple more Eagles in-house free agents. We already did the big four. We want to talk about Isaiah Rodgers. We want to talk about Orin Burks, two guys who could be of importance to the Eagles. And then we also are going to talk about Darius Slay, who the Eagles intend to release, but could be brought back or could find a job somewhere else. And then in the next part, because of Rodgers and Slay's uncertainty, we'll just get into the cornerback picture altogether in free agency and see what it looks like, because the Eagles will probably need a body there or two, especially if Slay and Rodgers don't come back. So let's start with the in-house guys. It's different, right, when you were doing guys like Rodgers and Burks, Orin Burks, because unlike the Sweats and the Milton Williamses and the Becktons, these guys are not starters. So their snaps are different. You know, you specialize in predictive modeling. What is it like? How different is it when you're going on guys who have limited snaps?
Yeah, it's definitely tougher, especially because there's this much smaller sample size. So you have to kind of extrapolate a little bit of the data, like through the data, and you also need to look at kind of more the average. So a lot of the time, a way to kind of account for that is you look at what the average player's statistics are and what they make. And from that determination, it becomes a lot easier to project, because the average is just like the replacement level. What is that? A typical NFL corner or linebacker make? So that's a good place to start for guys like that.
Right. Now, we always say this, and it's sort of our disclaimer. When you're working with predictive modeling, there's just context that can't be quantified, right? Something like locker room leadership, and some guys really look for that. Some teams look for that. Injuries, that impacts your games played, but not necessarily a model that can dictate your performance versus your valuation, right? And a host of other factors. There, we talk about the one team that just decides to go berserk and overpay, or the one guy who you think is going to have a huge market. We thought this about Isaac Seumalo years ago because teams told us he was the number one guard center on the board, but because of his past injury history, he wound up signing a more team-friendly deal. That's stuff that's hard to get in your predictive modeling, but you're always tinkering with your modeling to try to make it cleaner and more efficient.
Sure. Yeah, modeling is never perfect, but there are ways you can project what that value is based on their resume and based on that platform year. And when you have that, it just gives you an indication of their fair market value, not necessarily what they'll make on the market because of all the factors you stated amongst a lot of other ones. So essentially what these models do is give you a nice baseline of value. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of evaluate a team based on whether, they overpay or underpay for a player, right? So that's where the true value is. So these models just help everyone get a sense of what that would look like on a fair market, which we also know is not always the case too.
Someday maybe we can do an episode in the future on not players, but teams, their free agency signings and habits, and sort of see whether the modeling was where they signed compared to what the modeling said, and did it work out versus didn't work out. I can think of a team we can do that for, the Eagles, maybe a year or two or three down the road. So that'll be an interesting study for us.
That would be really interesting, especially since we have all the data already. It should be pretty easy in a couple of years once we, see the effects of their play.
Absolutely. All right. So let's start off with the in-house guys. We'll go with Isaiah Rodgers, who is someone who played well in his limited role as a backup corner, is still young, can run, but again, has sort of context that might be hard to put in a model as far as missing a year from being suspended and how the league will view him in that way. But he is going to be a free agent barring any last second extension. So talk about your modeling and what it might say about him.
Yeah, so the corner model is very different than any model I've built in the past. I'm really proud of it. We ran a basically to find out what the statistically significant variables were for corners, which is the same thing I did with my quarterbacks and the receivers model. and it came back with 4 variables that are really important for corners, particularly with their value. And that was snaps per game, missed tackle rate, quarterback rating against, and yards per target. And so within those parameters, like I said, we focused a lot on the average. So I think it's important to establish what the average NFL corner statistics are in those categories. Mm-hmm. So the average NFL corner, and this was from the entire, so we went back about 4 or 5 years of data to determine this sample that we used for the study. So this was the 2020 season, 2021 season, 2022 season, 2023 season, and 2024 season. And the average corner that was signed in that period played 50.89 snaps. Mm-hmm. They had a missed tackle rate of 12.67%. They had a quarterback rating against of 95, and they allowed 7.6 yards per target. Just understanding that number, let's look at Isaiah Rodgers, who had 24.76 snaps per game, which is significantly lower than the average corner that's been paid, and we've kind of established that. But his missed tackle rate was better than average at 12.5%, 0.17% better than average. Mm-hmm. His quarterback rating against was also better by almost 10 points. It was 85.4. His yards per target was significantly better at 2 yards less than average, which is incredible. But with all that together, we had to, look at his resume and basically what he did in his limited action.
Right.
In that, he projects slightly lower than the average corner. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if he played more stats, it's very possible that he'd be a much higher paid player, but that's not necessarily a guarantee either.
Right.
So for that, we've determined that his market value would be, pardon me 1 second, it would be $6.519 million a year. Mm-hmm. That would be the average annual value.
Okay, so that would be interesting because that's sort of a middle ground between what an established corner signs for on a 1-year prove-it deal. Because we're going to assume here, I mean, maybe a team goes 2 years on him because he's young, but he's probably not signing like a 5-year deal, like a really landmark free agent deal. Absolutely. So the high end for that, like a Stephon Gilmore made $10 million with the Vikings. Christian Fulton made like 2.5 to 3, maybe it was 3. So you could see where, and that was with the Chargers that Fulton signed with. And he had some struggles. Rodgers is young. He runs in the 4.3s, I believe. He blew it up at the combine when he ran. So he has a lot of that upside, but he also has that you're a backup and then you missed the year before downside. So it feels like that 6.5 is an interesting number because it sort of says he's a contract where we think you can start to be our number 2 corner, but we're not absolutely sure about that either.
Yeah, absolutely. And just so you know, I didn't mention it, but the average corner was at $6.9 million a year. Mm-hmm. So again, slightly lower than that number. And I think that's important. Based on what his market seems to be, formulating, it seems to be about 3 to 7.5 million. So he's pretty close. Like his value is pretty high end of that. So if the Eagles were able to retain him at lower than that 6.5, it's a good deal for them.
I would agree. And I think that, again, this is where we get into the you just don't know. A team, the Colts had him, so they know what he's like, and he's played against other teams before. They know he can run. They know he's young, right? And if you're evaluating his tape from the Eagles as a backup, you're probably looking at it and saying, yes, he's on the shorter side, so that might be a liability, but he can run and he made plays in this Eagles defense. So it's an interesting predictive model there because it feels like it could go either way. And I do think the number you hit on here at 6.5 seems like a reasonable in between because you're not exactly sure what you're going to get. But I agree with you. If it winds up being the lower end, 3 to 5, that makes it a pretty good to me. I mean, you just don't know what the Eagles are going to do. I mean, they may have a trade for somebody else in mind. They may want to move Cooper DeJean out there, but 3 to 5, they didn't want to pay Darius Slay $16 million in cash for obvious reasons. 3 to 5 for a young player like that who's already in your building seems to make a lot of sense. So we'll see
My
what.
guess is he probably is in that 3 to 5 range too, but from a pure value standpoint, what he brings to the table would be in excess of that.
Right. Love how you're able to separate that too, what the value is based on the data versus the reality of a situation, which isn't always exactly the same. Good stuff on that. Well, why don't we talk about Isaiah? Not Isaiah. We just did that. Why don't we talk about Orin Burks now? Another interesting guy who's a backup. And there's context here. The context is even though the Eagles re-signed Zach Bond, Nakobe Dean's coming off an injury. So the Eagles might value him in the system more than the rest of the NFL might value a guy who has good size and produced well as a backup. But to be fair, in the NFL, inside linebackers tend to be a dime a dozen. That's the way teams view them. So what did your model tell you on Orin Burks?
Yeah, so Orin Burks so we're back to my linebacker model, which is a little bit different than the corner one, which we discussed in the previous videos. It has him, in this like 2.5 to $3.5 million range. And we kind of came to that conclusion based on some comps, and the comps that we looked at were, Jordan Hicks in 2023, Eric Kendricks in 2023, and Duke Riley in 2022, which there's a wide spread amongst those 3 guys.
Yeah. 2 former Eagles, by the way. Interesting.
Yes, it kind of worked out that way. We didn't go in like looking for that. It just the age range and the statistics kind of lined up.
And the brother of a former Eagle, if we're going to throw Eric Kendricks in there.
Yes, but familiar faces nonetheless.
Sure.
All 3 of them had better pressure statistics, but that really isn't the way the Eagles necessarily play that position. So that's okay. It didn't really deter us from using that statistic. What was interesting is the stop statistic, which again is one of my favorite statistics, just because it really captures, defensive efficiency. I think that's the best way to put it, And so they were pretty close. So both Hicks and Kendricks, and Hicks got $4 million per year, and Kendricks got $3 million a year, were higher in stops, but it was 2.5 and 2.6 to 2.08. So it's not that significantly different. And they also played more games. So, but Duke Riley was significantly lower at 0.71. Basically, tackles is our next statistic. And basically all of them were close. They were both in the 5 range. Orin Burks was in 3.75. Again, they played a little bit more games. Duke Riley was at 1.4. So you can see where the market kind of separates there.
Right.
Missed tackle rate was kind of all over the place with them. It's not really a great indicator in that specific context. But quarterback rating, Orin Burks had better when targeted. So he fits kind of squarely within that little subsection of the market. And that's why 2.5 to 3.5 makes sense.
Yeah, the Eagles signed him last year at a 1-year deal for $2.5 million. And you think the way he played for them, if they want to bring him back, they could even give him 2 years just because, why not, right? If you have Nakobe Dean coming back from an injury. You only really have Jeremiah Trotter, who they like, but in the pipeline. Ben Van Sumeren's also coming off an injury. It was an undrafted guy that they were using at fullback. I mean, if you like Orin and you love his leadership and his production and you saw the way he played for them throughout the playoffs, 2-year deal would probably be good. And I would imagine if you paid him $2.5 million a year, you could give him a little bit of a bump to 3.5 to 4. Again, it might be something where the Eagles value it just a little bit more in-house, good leader, good special teamer, thin at the position, and you give him 2 years, $8 million at 4 per year, which is a little over that. But if he walks, then maybe I don't know if he can get better than that on the market. So that's why if you're the Eagles, you don't mind giving him that and nothing more.
I mean, we saw the Eagles do that with both Barkley and Bond, right? I think both of them are probably a little bit higher than the value that my data would have projected, and probably most models would project is probably a little bit on the higher end. But they like to reward their players and keep them when they can.
Right. Good stuff. Okay. Then that's certainly a deal the Eagles could afford. And, it's kind of a typical Eagles inside linebacker deal until Zach Bond came along. Let's move on to Slay. And then in the next segment, we'll do a little bit bigger picture of all the cornerback positions. But the Eagles did not want to pay Darius Slay $16 million in cash. I believe that's what it was owed. Now there's a chance he can come back on a much smaller dollar figure. And I like your model because it's not as if he didn't play like a $16 million corner, because 16 million for good corners in this league is actually a deal, but he is 30. What was it? 34?
He's 34. Yeah.
33. Yeah. So I think he's good. He'll be 34 in the season. And then he's got the knee issues, which again, predictive modeling can't take into account, but his knees had a lot of maintenance, and, you saw him coming in and out of games, which is why Isaiah Rodgers was able to get in there at times. So he's an interesting one because he's already made it sound like he's fine with retiring if the deal isn't there. And this is not going to be a guy who, like, I think 8 or 9 or 10 teams are lining up to sign. So his market's going to be somewhat interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, there's a good chance he goes back to Detroit too. I think Eagles or Detroit make a lot of sense based on, just familiarity,
Mm-hmm.
But I love that you say that 16 million number, because you segue me perfectly in. My model says his value is about 16.5 million. That's
because he's a good starting corner. Right. Yeah.
And he played phenomenally last year. It was one of his best seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And based on the statistics and the variables and the adjustments we made, his value is 16.5. Now, I don't think anybody on the market is actually going to get to that 16.5. I think you said that pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
From my understanding, his market is around 8 to 13 million would be probably a fair range. So anybody that signs him, theoretically, if he can play to that same level, is getting a bargain. Mm-hmm. Assuming he can stay on the field and assuming he can. There's a lot of assumptions in there, but based on what we have today, that framework, they would be getting a steal.
Yeah, and I think even the 8 to 13 makes sense because now you're sort of factoring in some of those external factors. But, the age in that position in particular, how like the Eagles used to look at guys, anybody who turned 30 as like, no, we're not doing that anymore. I think the age combined with the knee, combined with his selectivity means that he's probably limiting his own market too. I don't think he's going to want to go play for a mid-level contender. Like maybe the Steelers call up and he's like, I'm in it to just win a championship. So it just might be Detroit, Philadelphia, or I'll retire happily and walk off into the sunset with a ring. So I think that's what that threatens to change this whole conversation about what his market and his paycheck really look like.
Certainly. Yeah. When you limit your market, that's what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So those are the 3 in-house Eagles that were left for us to wrap up after we did the core 4 before. That was Rodgers, that was Burks, that was Slay. In our next segment, we'll just do an overall look at the cornerback picture because, as we said, the Eagles might be looking at this spot if they don't retain Slay, Rodgers, one or the other, or both. And we'll see what the free agent market looks like. All right, we'll talk about that on our next edition. For Sam Finkel, I'm Geoff Mosher. You've been watching Inside the Birds.